All right, joining me now is National Senator and the Opposition's Transport spokeswoman, Bridget McKenzie. Bridget McKenzie, thank you. Let me start with this recent policy announcement by the Coalition, seen as a win for the Nats, a divestiture, big stick for the supermarkets. Can you explain how it would practically work?
Yeah, great to be with you, Andrew. Well, divestiture powers are competition powers that are in a range of our highly developed nations around the world, from the US, the UK, Canada and Europe. And it's a long missing piece of our own competition framework. It's been something supported by competition leaders such as Cascott-Leeb, Sims, Fells and others, that at the end of the line, when you've got highly concentrated markets, you need a lever at the end of the road for when unconscionable behaviour is being perpetrated, particularly on the supply chain, that there needs to be a mechanism to deal with that. And so we announced that along with making the Food and Grocery Code compulsory, mandatory, that there would be a divestiture provision in our competition framework that, following a court order, would be able to break up our supermarkets in this case. Now, Andrew, I want your viewers to be very clear that there are a range of safeguards around that. When we look at it, needs to be in the public interest. We need to look at job losses and shareholders' impact. But at the end of the day, if big business, supported by big unions, are going to continue to behave badly and rip off suppliers and rip off Australian consumers, then at the end of the day, we're going to have a reasonable mechanism to deal with that behaviour.
Now, the former ACCC Commissioner Graham Samuel is not on that list you mentioned of people who welcome the policy. He heavily criticised it during the week. He said it was a populist disgrace, not the sort of policy you'd expect from the Liberal Party. What do you make of that?
Well, he's one out of four former chairs of the ACCC who has that view. The current chair, Cascott-Leeb, former chairs, Professor Fells and Rob Sims, all think this is an absolutely necessary tool within our competition framework that we need to have, like other competitive economies, capitalist economies such as ours. So this is not the first lever to be pulled when big business is behaving badly. It is at the end of the line after a range of, examinations, including going through the courts, have been through. But at the end of the day, we know, we've heard through Senate inquiry after Senate inquiry, egregious behaviour by the supermarkets has been evidenced on the supply chain. We know that when, prices drop at the wholesale end, they're not being transferred through to the checkout. And that is behaviour that needs to be addressed. And we make no apology for standing with small business and with the Australian consumer. The outliers here are the Labor Party across the whole Parliament, left and right, who actually are continuing to stand with big business and continuing to stand with big unions. But it's very on brand for them.
What about the Labor argument you've effectively taken on a Greens proposal?
Well, this has been a National Party proposal for a very, very long time. And as I've said, Andrew, capitalist economies such as the United States, such as the UK, such as Canada, all have this provision within their framework. We are absolutely the outlier internationally. So when you have a market such as ours, and it's not just the supermarket sector where we see hyper-consolidation, we tend towards monopolies and duopolies, that there isn't this mechanism with which to say you either behave yourselves within this competitive framework appropriately, or we will have an end-of-the-road resort to break you up. We heard evidence in the Qantas inquiry last year about the aviation sector, 92% consolidated there, and the egregious behaviour of particularly Qantas, holding both the high end and the lower end of that market. So we believe this is an appropriate response. It is one backed by international evidence, and we look forward to putting that forward to the Australian public.
Let me ask now about the other action in the Senate during the week. Payman resigning from Labor. What do you make of her actions, and her involvement with Glenn Drury, the preference whisperer?
Well, I think a lot of people have been claiming that Senator Payman is being very naive in her approach over the last 2 years, and particularly with response to how caucus works. I think what it also shows is the Labor Party is quite naive in how it's pursued identity politics, and now it's been dacked by that reality. We don't want to see sectarianism take over Australian politics at all. But this problem is an issue of the Prime Minister's own making. His weakness when anti-Semitic behaviour has been evidenced at the Opera House, on suburban streets, our university campus, and most embarrassingly at Parliament House itself last week. This guy has been left floundering and focused more on internal factional politics and, constructing his foreign policy through the lens of how it'll impact Western Sydney. And I think you're seeing that reality now. The fact that Glenn Drury's talking to Senator Payman, I'm not surprised. Whether that will result in a sectarian party being created, I think remains to be seen. I think it's not just the Islamic issue that Western Sydney and indeed northwest Melbourne's got a problem with. It's that Labor's taken these communities for granted for a long time, failed to invest in critical infrastructure, and whilst, seeing the population pressures most evidenced in those suburbs. So it's not just, Islamic teals, for want of a better phrase, that I think the Labor Party is going to be challenged by, but I think high-profile independents, as we saw through Di Lee's election in the last federal election, becoming more popular. So
perhaps Frank Carbone running against Chris Bowen, for example, as well.
Well, I think that's been reported, but it's not just in Sydney. We've seen reports today that the Labor government in Victoria, the Premier failed to disclose to Cabinet the numbers around the suburban rail loop and leaving western and northern suburbs out of that particular project or out of significant infrastructure investment to deal with their population pressure is also meaning that those typically Labor heartland seats in Melbourne are feeling left out and neglected by a Labor government whose priorities are all wrong. And I think that's the tension we're seeing with the Prime Minister. Every time this guy has to make a call, he makes the wrong one, not in the interests of the Australian public, who right now are wondering how they're going to pay their mortgage and deal with their skyrocketing rent or their own small business going bust as a result of their economic policies. All
right, let's move on to the NDIS. We heard Bill Shorten attacking the opposition for not immediately supporting his reforms. He also ruled out, he also said he's going to put in place regulations if this legislation passes, banning things like sex work, cryptocurrency, all these matters from people spending NDIS money on it. Do you welcome that? And shouldn't the reforms go through as quickly as possible to cut down some of this waste?
Well, Andrew, it's really fascinating that Labor expects the opposition and the parliament to back their so-called reforms without any level of scrutiny. We've sensibly sent this to a Senate inquiry to flesh out the issues. I think the fact that so many of these issues that you speak about, people going on cruises, the use of prostitutes and sex workers and the like, the misuse and rorting that's going on with the NDIS isn't front and centre, isn't subject to a public inquiry, and that's what we've sought to do. Now, as soon as that has been completed, and we've heard from not just the sector but clients of the NDIS, etc., then we will be developing maybe our own amendments to that legislation. This is how Parliament should work. We all want the NDIS to be a success. We want it to support our most vulnerable, but we do not want it to see it overtaking Medicare in terms of how much of the federal budget it requires. It needs to be sustainable so that those most vulnerable in our community can have that support across their lifetime. And we're not going to be, bullied by Bill in rushing the decisions that need to be heard or rushing the evidence that this Senate inquiry needs to hear.
All right, there's a report this morning that axing the cashless debit card in Indigenous communities has led to a surge in gambling, public drunkenness and alcohol-related violence. Your reaction?
Well, Andrew, I just find this incredible that it needed a freedom of information request from media to actually get this report out into the public domain. Last year, you couldn't shut the government up about how much it cared for Indigenous Australians. Whilst they simultaneously shut down the cashless debit card, everybody told them that this was going to lead to alcohol-fuelled violence, child neglect, etc. That's exactly what you are seeing, thanks to the University of Adelaide. And I want to know why Linda Burney isn't quoting this report and why Amanda Rishworth, as a Social Services Minister, isn't on the front steps saying it's an indictment and we need to reinstate the cashless debit card or actually do something in these communities. So, again, it is Labor saying one thing to appease identity politics and refusing to act on the very real issues that are affecting Australians day to day, and in this case, Indigenous Australians in remote communities.
Just finally, the Coalition's nuclear policy. Peter Dutton released the plan, but there hasn't been much on it since, other than his speech at the LNP conference yesterday. What's the strategy here?
Which was met with applause. I was in the room, and there's a lot of support in that room for his nuclear policy. Sorry, right. Andrew, I butted in.
All right, no problem. I'm just saying, what's the strategy? How hard are you going to sell it?
Well, we're absolutely committed to having a credible plan to net zero by 2050 that keeps the lights on and the jobs here at home. We've announced where those sites will be. Labor was hoping to run a scare campaign. They're going to be unable to do that, and we will be releasing costings in a timely fashion. The reality is Labor's renewable-only plan won't work, and we need to be availing ourselves of our gas resources as our coal-fired generation comes offline over the next decade, and making sure when we get to 2050 and beyond that we're going to stay a rich and prosperous country, and that includes nuclear.
All right, Bridget McKenzie, thanks for your time.
Always, Andrew.